From far above Cayuga's waters, welcome back to Cornell Keynotes. I'm Tom O'Toole from the Cornell Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy. We've got a great show lined up for you today to tackle one of the most pressing questions of our time. How confidently should we rely on artificial intelligence? And most important, when does AI deserve our trust? When should we be guided by a healthy skepticism? Thanks to our partnership between eCornell, the Cornell Brooks School of Public Policy, I'm joined by Dr. Tasha Austin-Williams from Deloitte. Welcome, Dr. Austin-Williams. Thanks for joining us on Cornell Keynotes.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Viewers, we'll take your questions in chat. If you want to ask a question, just be sure to include your name, where you're joining us from. Also, a heads up for resources, useful URLs, including links to programs, courses on AI, ethics, and decision-making. In addition, we'll be asking for your participation in a few poll questions. So heads up for a QR code that'll appear momentarily. So Dr. Austin-Williams, you've got deep experience in leadership, education, in AI. Maybe we can start by having you just talk a bit about your career, how you got involved with AI, and the work that you're doing with Deloitte.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. It's nice to virtually connect with all of you. I am a principal at Deloitte, and I do a lot of work in our public sector that involves our federal agencies, state and local governments, as well as our higher education business. And my world started and my path started with AI through the love of math and being very curious about problem solving. And so I'm all into the art of problem solving. And I just made for a very nice career path at Deloitte, where I spent a lot of time helping clients focus on areas back at the time around data and analytics and automation. And then it just continued to sort of evolve into this space now that most of us are leaned into, called AI. And so I spend a lot of time helping my clients really think through their business problem sets and trying to understand whether AI is a possible solution for their problem set. And if it is, we start thinking about what the strategy looks like, what governance look like, all the things we're going to talk about today, continuous monitoring mechanisms. What does it look like when we think about adoption and making sure you have a ready AI workforce? And so I do a lot of work, particularly with clients in the federal government space. And then I do have a few clients on the higher education side where the universities are definitely looking to drive more AI enablement. Outside of the day-to-day client efforts, I am also a part of our leadership team that really helps think about what it means for Deloitte to have an AI-ready workforce. And so that journey is pretty interesting in making sure everybody can get comfortable with these solutions inside our organization. And then when it comes to social impact, I spend some time helping solve problems in the community with AI and trying to understand, are we doing it in a way that can deliver the outcomes that will help elevate the communities? And so I have lots of examples of how I do that if anybody ever wants to know. And then, Tom, I know we will get to questions regarding some of the other things I do outside of Deloitte, and so we can talk about them then. But it's really nice to be here. Thank you again for having me.
Great, thank you. And so just given the dizzying evolution of artificial intelligence, even over the past several months, some in our audience might be AI novices and even have a difficult time keeping track of what AI is, what it's doing in our global workforce. So maybe just to set the table a bit, can you give us a sense of the different types of AI and maybe some examples of how these different types of AI are being used across business and government?
I love your word choice of dizzy, because sometimes it doesn't feel that way. There's a lot going on, right? And I think the best way to think about AI is not by memorizing the tools and the models that are out there, because that list will be outdated before you and I wrap up this Zoom, because there's a lot happening. But if you are thinking about AI, the first thing I encourage my clients to think about is, what problem are we trying to solve? And if AI is a good solution for that, then we can think about the different types of AI, to your question. So there's predictive AI, where you may be wanting to predict risk. You might want to predict the progression of a disease outbreak. You may even want to predict attrition. You may want to predict fraud. And then there's generative AI, which I think a lot more people are leaned into this space when it comes to AI's ability to generate new content, new analysis, new software code, images, videos, et cetera. And then today we're seeing an increasingly interest in agentic AI, which is going beyond just answering a question, but at the same time, the ability for AI to act in an autonomous way is where you typically fall into the agentic AI domain. And then I don't know if you've noticed, Tom, but the models have gotten really good when it comes to advanced reasoning. And I think that's something that people are really leaning into when it comes to sort of the multimodal domains that we talked about, where the reasoning is just sort of coming through pictures, videos, text, images, et cetera. And so that's been pretty interesting. And so what I've seen today, a lot of my clients use AI in, whether I'm in my higher education space, on a federal agency side, when we think about improper payments and identifying and detecting those, AI has been pretty helpful there. There's a lot of people that deal with sort of case management, and intelligent routing is an area where AI has been a true enabler in that process. Obviously, we're seeing it a lot in an organization's operations, from procurement with contract analysis type tools to predicting financial scenarios to all of the other operations of the organization. And so clients are really thinking about how AI can be an enablement to sort of speed up and drive more efficiencies. We're seeing it in emergency management when it comes to allocations of resources. And then I spend a lot of time with my teams on the ground, and I'm seeing them use it every day for their own personal productivity, where maybe something that took them hours to do is now taking them minutes to do. And that's been pretty impressive to see that. And so I do think as we continue to sort of stumble across really good use cases, one of the things I would encourage all of us is to continue to share the leading practices, because we all have different journeys and how we drive AI enablement. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. And I know we'll hit on some of the questions that'll start to dig a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of us might have been preconditioned, maybe even by some of the science fiction surrounding AI, to kind of fear and distrust what AI is, what it can do. But some of the concerns regarding AI might be very reasonable given the pace of its development. So from your perspective, what are some of the key trust issues around AI that you're seeing in your practice?
Yeah, and the science fiction thing is interesting. We have a neighbor that my husband and I always debate with, because he watched a Netflix series, Cassandra, and he just absolutely doesn't trust AI, right? And there's lots of AI type movies or series out there, right? But I do think, to some extent, my neighbors and others that are sort of debating, whether they should trust AI, I do think distrust in AI is somewhat healthy, right? Because there's just a lot of things that can go wrong. And so usually the domains that I'm seeing a lot of distrust issues when it comes to AI is in bias and fairness, obviously accuracy and hallucinations, the data and privacy, misinformation. We're seeing a lot of that sort of flow through social media channels. Data privacy, I may have mentioned that, manipulation. And then I think the idea that these technologies are increasingly becoming autonomous seems to be sort of another area that people are starting to not have as much trust in, because they're sort of taking action and doing things, the capability is doing things on its own. But what I will tell you, Tom, is the other trust issue that I'm worried about is over-reliance on AI. I think that there's a lot of people that just sort of let AI do its thing and they run with it. I was talking with one of my girlfriends not too long ago, and she was mentioning that, one of the tools were down and she didn't know what to do. My nephew literally did the same thing last week. One of the AI solutions that they depend on, that's a preferred choice for them, the tool was down, and he called me and was like, "Aunt Tasha, like, what should I do? This tool is down." And I said, "You should use your brain." And I mean, if you could have seen the way he looked at me, I'm like, "Yeah, you're clearly over relying on this stuff." And I did see a survey last week that said something about 2/3 of a survey that they did around use of AI and trust in AI. 2/3 of the respondents said they trust their manager more than they would trust AI. Why? Because their manager wouldn't judge them. Because AI was always available, but the AI wouldn't judge them. AI was always available, and AI was likely to tell them things that their manager would not tell them. So I do think, aside from all of the domains that I mentioned as far as trust issues, that there is this issue with over reliance, such that you're leaning on it too much. And I'm afraid that, you could lean on it so much that you just start to remove the exercising of your human judgment. And so I think we need to be concerned just as much as we should be about some of the other domains I mentioned.
Right. And in your opinion, so how should we think about trust in AI? Should we think about it in terms of its accuracy, in terms of its transparency, or maybe even in terms of the values that it reflects?
I think it's all three. Plus, I would add some more. I think it's also explainability, and I think there is an opportunity to be thoughtful about accountability, right? And so for accuracy, yes, you do want to know if AI works, right? Transparency, you want to know, can you understand it enough to know what it's actually doing? For values, you want to be thoughtful about, is it doing the things and producing outcomes that align with my values and my beliefs? And can I be accepting of those decisions that AI may be informing or in some cases actually making, right? And then obviously explainability. Can I explain the outcomes of the AI system? Why did it make the decisions that it did? And then from an accountability perspective, well, we know we can't point to AI as the accountable party if something were to go wrong. And so there is this idea of who's responsible for it, and it certainly isn't AI. And then we need to be thoughtful about the different types of outcomes that AI produces, where we might think certain percentages that look favorable are really good answers and outcomes, and they may not be. So, for example, if AI is recommending a restaurant and it has 90% accuracy and recommending a restaurant that's really good, that 90% may sound fascinating. But imagine if it was also saying, hey, I flagged 90% of the people that I think are high risk, or, I've denied 90% of the folks that were looking for a benefit. Maybe they were doing some sort of claims or trying to get some sort of eligibility requirements to align with their needs. And 90% might not be the 90% that's acceptable in that particular instance, because why is it denying that many benefits, right? Why is it flagging that many people? And so we do need to think about the outcomes and make sure we question them in a way that aligns with our values. And so I would just say, as I'm thinking about all of the ways that you can leverage AI and understanding what all should factor in as far as, how I trust it, I would be thinking about, is AI trustworthy enough for what decision? Who's being affected by those decisions, under what conditions, and what are the actual consequences when I'm actually trying to leverage AI to produce an outcome? And as you start to ask those questions, you'll start to think about, okay, where does values, where does transparency, where does accountability, where does accuracy, where does all of that play a part in this?
Yeah. We have a question from one of our audience members, from Shashi. So what are some ways, this goes back to your point regarding knowledge, skills, abilities, atrophy. What are some ways that academic institutions or even employers can try to mitigate that atrophy due to AI over-reliance? Any thoughts?
Yeah. So I work with my teams every single day on this, because the thing is, if I take AI away from you, right, and you've been using it, and I take it away from you, I want you to still be able to do the things that you were doing before AI came in to the mix, right? And so there is that, where we were saying, okay, if AI wasn't in this domain of work that we're doing, then what would we typically do? So there's always that, right? Because I gave the example of when the system went down, it may not always be available. So now what do you actually rely on? But the other thing that we do is we're very thoughtful about where AI plays a part and where humans should be in a loop. And so we will do a lot of scenario activities or simulations where we will say, okay, here's the problem that's on the table. Where should you think about leveraging AI? And where is AI off the table? Where does a human come in? And this is sort of like a repeated practice that we have to go through. It's not always as simple as saying don't over rely. It's like, let's think about the activity at hand, the problem statement, and let's talk about where AI can play a role, as well as where the human should be in a loop. And I think the more that you start to do that, the more you start to realize that it can do a lot of things, but it probably shouldn't. And the higher the stakes, the more you need to be thoughtful about where you actually lean in versus where AI comes in to play. I think the other area around over-reliance does come down to just really understanding the literacy piece of all of this, right? So the governance, and I know we'll talk a little bit about governance, but when you start to understand what can go wrong, if you're producing AI and you're running with a summary report that it gave you to take to whatever it is, another client meeting, or maybe you're doing a briefing in front of an audience, et cetera, you really should be checking the resources or sourcing the information of where that data came from. We've seen a lot of things go wrong in the media when people actually don't cite those sources. In some cases, sources may be named in an AI output that don't really exist. And so I also think some of this is just learning lessons and leading practices that when you bring those issues to the forefront, and people start to realize, well, that's not the consequence, or that's not the reputation that I want to build, then you'll start to be more thoughtful about some of the governance mechanisms that you put in place to really lean in and say, yeah, probably shouldn't over rely on that. And it is just through repeated experiences, repeated simulations, reinforcement around training. And it does take some time to do that, because I know they're pretty powerful, such that you can run with it. And then someone mentioned something the other day around, we tend to have folks that procrastinate a lot. And so at the last minute, they'll do something and say, well, I know I can quickly get through it because I got AI, so I can quickly, and then you realize maybe it won't work out that way. And so there's that issue as well. And so we're battling a number of things when it comes to over reliance, but I do think it's just the continuous reinforcement of guardrails and showing people what could go wrong. And we do a lot of simulation activities. And so I think that's probably one of the best ways to get through it.
Thanks. And so Paul asked a great question from our audience. Can you define trust such that it's measurable, how trust varies across domains, how trust increases? And it kind of it's very aligned with the next question I was going to raise. When we think about, trust in human relationships, it's often the case that trust is earned over time. But given that most people might not have direct contact with AI in their daily lives, should we expect AI to earn our trust in the same way, or should we hold it to maybe a higher standard, given the scale and scope of what it can do?
Yeah, I think the best example I can give is sort of the trust you build one-on-one, and then how that translates into the trust you build with AI. So first of all, definitely it should be at a higher standard when it comes to earning the trust from AI, right? Because AI has something that individual humans typically don't have, and that's enormous scale and speed, right? So this is the best example I can give. When I first started dating my husband now, I didn't automatically trust Adrian, and I shouldn't have, right? And so he had to build experiences and repeat those experiences over time to earn my trust. What worked well for me? He needed to understand that. How was he being consistent? How was he prioritizing me? How was he, keeping to maybe some of the promises that he made to me? Like, how was all of that working out? And if I got disappointed in something he did or vice versa, we could talk about it. We could learn from it. We could repair it. We could even decide whether we should stay in a relationship or not. But the most important thing was we were continuing those repeated experiences to build up trust. Now, let's flip that, because that was a repeated experience that then helped me ultimately trust my husband today. AI can do so much damage in very little time, and it can impact millions of people. So once something goes wrong, are you really going to say, let me repair this, let me see how this works out the next time with AI, even though it did this to me, maybe it can make me whole again? Maybe some of those things are true. But the reality is you can't leave experiences up to AI to be that experiment, right? You really have to lean in and say, let me make sure I'm asking the right questions. Let me do the right testing. Let me put the right monitoring controls in, the right governance guardrails in, bringing the humans in the loop at the right time in order to build up that trust. And trust has to be warranted when it comes to AI. And so trying to make sure that you have all that evidence before you lean in and trust AI is very different than just going through repeated experiences one-on-one and trying to build that trust. So I hope that makes sense, because it is very different, a very different dynamic with AI given what it can do.
Yep. And following on that last question, where should that trust be built? Should it be built, with the AI itself, the people that develop AI, the organizations that control it? And that question I'm an academic, right? So that's part A. And part B is kind of a question that Fatima is raising from our audience. So they want to know, like, how to break into the field where the focus is on bettering AI, right? So where do we build trust in AI? And so they're saying it doesn't seem like there are any jobs that are titled AI standards coordinator or something similar. So how do they spot job listings that would allow them to do the kind of work that's actively focused on building trust and bettering AI for the greater good?
Yeah. So one, to your question as to where should trust be built, AI, the developers, the organization, I would say all three matter, right? but I would say ultimately it is the organization. Because why? AI, a model can't go and accept accountability. It can't go in a courtroom and say, this is why the organization deployed me and why I did what I did. It certainly can't apologize to citizens that may have been impacted negatively by the AI, and it certainly can't compensate them, right? So let's put the model aside, right? There are things we want to do to make sure the model is doing what it needs to be done. And that's where the developers come into play. And they should be making sure that they are exercising the right steps to make sure that they're developing in a way that's going to produce responsible leadership. It is also responsible outcomes, and really looking at the outputs from those algorithms, right? And so the developers definitely have a responsibility. When I'm engaging with my teams, I'm repeatedly trying to understand what went into those models. How are you actually, trying to, work through the algorithm? What type of output is, resulting from the AI, and what types of questions are you asking, and where are you sort of coming in and validating all of that? So I do make sure that my developers, as an example, are operating under the right responsible AI principles, and they're exercising those every day as they're building things. But then there's the organizations that, literally are responsible for the consequences that come about when something goes wrong with AI. And it certainly isn't going to be something that gets pointed back to their technology stack. And so often think about a lot of this as part of the chain of trust. And if anything goes wrong in that chain of trust, which would be the data, the models, the developers, the organization, the decisions that the AI is making, as well as some of the human consequences. If anything in that chain of trust is all of a sudden a weak link, there's a big issue. And so I always say, well, you can delegate a task to AI, but you can't delegate accountability to AI. To the second question about when I'm looking, I'm not seeing jobs that focus on trust or, responsible AI leaders, et cetera. I think you may not be seeing that because by default, regardless of what job you do that involves AI, you're expected to operate under sort of a responsible AI set of principles. And that could be why. Sure, there may be some people that's their job all day long. And we are seeing that where some clients are like, I'm going to stand up a responsible AI. So the governance committee, they're going to be the ones that ask repeated questions about some of the tools that we're developing. They're going to understand where humans are in the loop. They're going to be measuring trust levels of the organization. There are steering committees that are set up to do that. But I think by default, what's happening is, and we certainly expect this at Deloitte, that our folks are operating with a guided set of principles that allow them to be able to look in the end at the outcomes of an AI capability and say, I think it's doing what it's supposed to do. And I've tested it and I've checked it and I have ways to continuously monitor it. And that's going to happen, I think, in any part of anyone's work, given the evolution of AI. And so I think regardless of what job you go into that looks like it has some sort of AI enablement that's intersecting with that particular job description, your best differentiator when you're trying to get into that job is to talk about the things that make for good, responsible techniques when it comes to AI. I just not quite sure we'll see a lot of those types of job descriptions explained that way, but I think it's because it's by default that you're sort of expected to operate that way. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, I think it does, and kind of that's a great segue into Isabel's question from our audience. So she's asking, should institutions in DC approach AI with a general use AI approach without providing a lot of training or thinking about impact on use cases for their workforces? So how are institutional approaches and incentives regarding AI adoption impacting how useful AI is? And then I'll add my own part B, like how do you prepare a workforce for AI transformation? Because there's a lot of, there can be a lot of fear, right? When you're readying a workforce for AI transformation, how do you go about doing that kind of top down and bottom up?
Okay, so top down, a lot of organizations are definitely going to focus on building the right set of trainings to make sure that their folks are getting upskilled and upskilled in a number of ways, right? Not upskilled where you're all of a sudden trying to be sort of the perfect employee that understands how not only to focus on responsible and trustworthy use of AI, but how you build these technologies, et cetera. So we do tend to take a role-based approach, right? There's a baseline understanding that we want everyone to have in an organization, and then based on your role in the organization, you may be the user, you may be the developer, right? And so what does that upskilling look like? And so we have all kinds of training. Some of them are pretty much baseline, some of them are foundation, some of those are role-based. So we do trust that the employees will take those trainings and that they will use what they've learned, right? And we may do reinforcement trainings where year over year we'll come back and say, these things have evolved. Here's some additional things we need you to learn. So I think from sort of the high level, we're trying to give everyone that they need, we're trying to give everything to our workforce that's needed in order for them to be successful in the way they leverage these technologies or the way they build them. Bottoms up, I would just talk about an example of some of the things that I do. I literally just did this the other day, and I may have referred to it earlier. I will literally take my teams through different simulations to say, it's one thing to say, you know how to identify the different AI models, or you know what different terminology means when we talk about AI. It's another thing for them to come up every day in different scenarios so that I can understand how you're applying what you've learned. Because training and completion of a training does not mean you're effectively upskilled. It's how it shows up in your workflows, how it shows up in your thinking every day. And so I will put scenarios on the table and say, I'm going to give you 15 scenarios. And I want you to tell me your best answer to these. I literally just ran that survey the other day with my team. And there are some things that they still don't quite get right. And it's okay because it's a lot happening, right? And so that helps me understand, well, where else do I need to continue to lean in if there are some gaps being presented because they didn't quite answer that scenario the right way as far as how might I prioritize governance, what might be the right responsible technique to be thoughtful about, right? Or is that particular use case even a good use case for using AI from the beginning? So I think we're still trying to figure it out, Tom. I work with a lot of organizations that are still trying to figure it out. I think everybody, clearly agrees on let's actually put out, some AI literacy training. But I do think to really get to the bottom of it, you got to start doing some reinforcement testing, live conversations. Definitely simulations work really well. And the more we do that, I think it'll just start to become very natural as to how you think. And by the way, I may give you a scenario, Tom, and you may think one way, and I may give that scenario to somebody else, and they may think another way about it. But at the end of the day, as long as you can explain why you took the steps that you took, because there's not always one right answer, that's actually okay as well. And I just share that because that comes up sometimes with my teams as well. And so those are just some tactics. I'm sure there'll be other things that evolve as far as how we continue to get people prepared for transformative things that can happen with AI in their workforce. But those are just some tactical things that we're doing and that I'm doing with my teams to try to make sure that they can apply some of the things that they're learning day in and day out.
Great questions from the audience. Please keep adding them to chat. And that point, Tasha, is actually a great segue into this next question, because I think one of the more significant concerns with AI is that we really don't understand, in many cases, how AI arrives at decisions, right? So it's, I think back to my math teacher. They always want you to show your work, right? Show how you arrived at an answer. We really aren't asking that of AI. And a lot of businesses and government agencies are just taking the answer for granted. And that's kind of aligned with Isabel's point. It's kind of like a use AI, training or sort of way of thinking about this. Can we really trust a system that isn't showing its work, so to speak, and maybe whose reasoning we often can't fully understand or even explain?
That is a very interesting question. One, I love to show my work. When I was in math classes, it was like my most competitive advantage because I felt like I can get there to the answer really quickly and I can show you all the work that led me there and the answer is going to be right. I would just say I would challenge the premises a little bit more, Tom, as far as, showing its work, right? Because here's the thing. There's a lot of things that are a part of our lived experience where there's AI enablement that we just trust automatically. GPS systems. We trust streaming platforms when they recommend different movies or music. We trust smart security systems, right? So we've just naturally adopted a lot of stuff that clearly has AI embedded in it. And I don't think we're picking up the phone calling the companies of these tools and saying, give us all of the computational things that went into those solutions. We just don't do that, right? My banking institution, I'll log in and they have all these fascinating financial scenarios and just all these things that they come up with where you can clearly see AI is a part of the analysis that they've shown me. But I'm not calling my banking institution saying, can you give me all the computation behind how you got to show me some of those things? And so I think we have to think about it the same way. And by the way, with humans, we don't do that either, Tom. We don't actually say, Charm, in order for me to trust you, you got to go through this entire checklist of things before I can say I trust you, right? Some people will say I trust you until I can't. And so I just want people to be thoughtful about that. And where I'm going with it is because we don't get perfect explainability from these tools. And that's not what we should be aiming for, right? We should be trying to understand, do we have enough evidence and traceability and oversight proportional to the risk of the decision, right? And so for consequential matters, you should be asking about, things such as, what data did you use? Was it complete data? What was the algorithm intended to do? How did you test it? What other guardrails were put in place? Where's the human come in the loop? And so as you can start to build up some of that evidence and you start to get comfortable, I think that's where you start to lean in a little bit more and say, okay, I think I got all the things I need to do and all the answers I need up front to be able to trust that maybe I should use this solution. But trust doesn't stop there. You got to continuously monitor these solutions, right? To make sure that it's still doing the things you need it to do. Is it still reflective of real world scenarios? Am I experiencing things like data drift or model drift? And is there an opportunity to update some of these things that the tool relies on? And so I don't think the answer is necessarily show me every calculation like back in the day with the math class example that you gave. I think it's show me the evidence that justifies why I should trust the outcome, keeping in mind that that might not mean it's showing you every computational thing that's happened behind the scenes. So I hope that that helps, because I think it's just impossible for it to be perfect in the way it explains everything.
Yeah, that was great. And so Douglas asked from our audience, he's asking about the use of AI in healthcare environments. So who's making decisions, who's responsible? But it's aligned with the next question that I was going to ask, which is about thinking about deploying AI in sensitive environments, right? So government, healthcare, where we're thinking about trusting AI to make potentially life-changing, perhaps life-threatening decisions. Thinking about hiring employees or diagnosing illnesses, investigating crimes, planning, executing military operations. From your perspective, are these spaces fair game for trusting AI deployment? So where do we set the limits of fair game for AI versus human judgment?
Yeah, so I would not obviously delegate everything to AI simply because we know AI can perform the task, right? To your point, there's criminal investigations, there's hiring, there's, medicine, there's certainly national security and other consequential domains. And so what you might start to see happening is things where maybe I would have delegated AI to inform or make a decision or operate in an autonomous way. It might certainly be okay in maybe the retail domain, right? But it may not be okay when we think about some of those other high stake domains that we just talked about. And so one of the things I like to think about is, if this decision goes wrong for what I'm using AI for, right? Then who gets hurt and how much is the impact, right? How bad is the consequence? And am I in a situation where I can make that community or those that have been impacted whole again? And if it's harder to sort of reverse the harm, I probably should not be leveraging AI for that, right? That's really where the human oversight comes in. And my doctor and I talk about this all the time. In fact, I will admit to my doctor, and I know this is a pretty simple example, but I think it's a really good one, where he'll give me my physical exam. I will literally scrub my data and run it through the AI tool of my choice, just to see what it's saying when it's summarizing some of those other complicated terms that I don't understand that come out of my physical exam, right? But I will also ask it to maybe adjust things like my diet based on what it's seen, or adjust maybe my workout routines, et cetera. I think those are safe spaces and safe ways to leverage AI. But what I always do is say, based on what it's telling me, let me call my doctor to make sure that based on the explanation it gave me, was that right? And based on the way it's telling me to rethink my diet, was that right? And based on the exercise routines it asked me to do, was that right? And so I'm still going to my doctor to say, hey, should I be doing these things because this is what I got out of that system? And I think in most cases, it's actually worked out okay. He may have some small tweaks, but that's sort of the way I think about where do I draw the line. I'm not going to put my personal data in there so that you can identify that the data that fed into that AI tool related back to me. So I'm removing some of my personal identifiers as I put things in there because I don't want AI to just take what I have and read the report in. But I do think it's a good way to think about from a personal sort of productivity space how I leverage AI. I would say, and I think we just did this last week, Tom, when I was at on campus, where we had some scenarios on the table for the students, and we said AI can do these 3 or 4 things based on this environment. What things would you allow AI to do, and what things would you say that's absolutely up to me? And again, I think the decision purely is based on what domain, what high stakes environment are we in, that has you start to think about what you're going to sort of preserve as your right to make that decision as opposed to turning it over to AI. And so there's no one perfect answer. I just think it depends on the environment that you're in and how consequential the impact could be should something go wrong with that decision.
Yep, great. And so Forrest Online in our audience is asking how to recommend that he teaches his company to recognize biased responses from AI. And I know that this is sort of what your PhD research was focused on or touched on. Can you tell us about that work and what you learned and how it sort of informs our understanding of AI bias?
Yes. And mine is a bit of a flip of the lens on how you think about bias, because as the question was asked, hey, these data, these systems, the systems, they come with bias, right? Which is true. When you use AI for good, though, you can also use AI to unpack human bias. And so the research that I did takes a different approach to looking at bias, because in the end, unless somebody wants to tell me that this isn't true, bias starts with us. It wouldn't have gotten into the data had it not been for the decisions that we've made. And we know once it gets into an AI tool, it just gets amplified. So it really comes back to us, right? And so one of the things I wanted to do was to show that when you use AI responsibly, you can use it as a bias preventer mechanism to unpack your own bias as a human. So what does that mean? I looked at data in both the higher education space as well as in the financial services space. And one of the things I wanted to do was to show, particularly if I just go with the example on the higher education side, there was an organization that actually provides scholarships to students in college, and they're humans making decisions as to who gets a scholarship and who does not. I wanted to look at word choices, the way people frame their stories. Usually there's an essay that comes with a lot of scholarship applications. There's other application features that come with that. And so I wanted to understand from the application features, including the way they told their story in their essays, based on whatever that question was that they had to respond to determine if they would get a scholarship or not. I want to understand if there was a high correlation with those scholarships that were approved versus those that were declined based on word choices and other application features. When I pull all that data together, you could clearly see that there were some words that were used that were highly correlated with the probability that someone would get a scholarship. And in this case, I had the decisions that were already made, so I could clearly see that, oh, you probably got a scholarship because of these features and because your story resonated with the human making the decision. But then there were some words that were used, and if you ever want to see this research, it's on my LinkedIn in the publication section, but there were some words that were used that you could clearly see just didn't resonate with the way you may specifically deem someone to be pretty successful if they were to get a scholarship, right? If I say I had childcare as part of my story because I'm trying to say I had a child and my expenses are sort of tied up in childcare expenses, which was one of the words that I saw, that doesn't mean that person wouldn't be successful. It just meant that they couldn't actually afford to go to school because they had childcare expenses, which is one of the stories that someone was trying to tell. And so there are a lot of other words that were part of that research that correlated with folks not getting a scholarship. And so my role was to provide some transparency into, hey, when you all are making decisions on scholarship applications in this scenario, be thoughtful about the words and the stories that people are telling, because they may sound different than what you're used to. And different doesn't mean that they should be declined a scholarship. Different just means they just have a different lived experience, but you want to be thoughtful about what you award and what you deny. And by the way, they couldn't give everybody a scholarship, so I understand that you got to deny some of them. But I wanted to give you an algorithm to be able to see the distribution of who you're proving and who you're denying based on these correlations. And if you're okay with that, fine. But if you're not, you have an opportunity to go back and update the way you're thinking about the stories and application features to make sure you're comfortable with the distributions of those folks that want to get a scholarship versus those that won't. And so that was the point of the research. And so there's lots of now bias preventer type mechanisms and algorithms out there, which is one that I wanted to contribute to be able to help people understand when they're in situations where they're making human decisions. And this can be in any domain. It doesn't just have to be in higher ed. People are still making human decisions in a number of organizations. But the idea was to be able to have some transparency into the impact of your decisions before you actually finalize those decisions. So that is a different twist on looking at bias, but certainly AI can be used as a bias sort of amplifier where you can actually say, hey, it looks like the human's doing something here. You may want to take a look at it.
Okay. And so one of the things that we're seeing is kind of a misalignment between the pace of technological development in the space and governance. So what are some of the best practices around AI governance that you're seeing in organizations that you work with that might help balance effective use of AI while addressing some of the AI trust concerns that we've been discussing, within organizations, among clients or constituents?
I think you'll start to see, and you can literally just go out there and type this in, but a number of folks are developing sort of responsible AI frameworks. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has an AI risk management framework that a lot of my clients in the public sector align to. They're looking at ways for you to think about bias and fairness. They're giving you techniques to think about privacy and protection of data and privacy of data such that you're using data for its intended outcome and not using it for anything else beyond that. Explainability and transparency is another area that the framework actually amplifies and gives tips and techniques to really work your way through those areas. Accountability, we kind of already talked about that. Reliability is another area that the NIST framework leans on, such that your models and your data, and I may have said this earlier, but making sure that they're always reflective of real world scenarios. And so that's getting out of sort of the data and model drift. So there's that framework for sure. We have a framework at Deloitte that we guide our clients through, which aligns really nicely with what NIST is doing too. And so I think you'll naturally see folks starting to develop some sort of agile governance framework with all the things that we talked about and all the things that need to be checked. There are techniques to sort of work through that. There are tools and different types of solutions out there to see if you can unpack bias and fairness, looking at the data in different ways to make sure there's no gaps in the data, especially when you're trying to solve problems for certain communities and making sure that those communities are reflective of that data. So there's all kinds of things that come up. The risk tiering is another area that we focus on, Tom, to your point. Criminal investigations, when you're in healthcare, national security, et cetera, those are very high stakes environments. So the way you apply governance and guardrails might be different in those environments and in those domains in which you might do in a domain that may not be perceived as a higher risk domain. So there's that. And then there are governance questions that I take my clients through. There's about 6 of them. I'll go back and post them on LinkedIn because I typically try to emphasize these. But think about when you are using an AI solution or you're thinking about deploying something. Are you prepared to own those consequences? Because some people will say, I'm not, I changed my mind. I'm not going to use AI for that because I don't think I want to own the consequences if something goes wrong. That in itself is a governance decision. When it comes to representation gaps, is the data representative for the communities that I want to solve for? Am I making this process of deploying AI an inclusive journey such that the folks that are going to be most impacted by these technologies, they're a part of the design phase. They're a part of me deploying it, testing it, and helping me continuously monitor the things that are going right with the tool versus the things that may need to be revisited. And so there's a number of things. And then there are governance decisions such as, am I focused on getting to the market quicker because it matters that I have the competitive advantage, or do I need to slow down and put in the right ethical guardrails because I don't want to get this wrong? And so you do have some folks making those trade-offs where some are wanting to get to market quicker and they'll try to quickly think about guardrails, but some of them are saying, based on what we do, we need to slow down a little bit and put in the right ethical speed bumps such that these things don't go wrong. And so I do think there is a lot to be considered. Again, it depends on the domain, but there are definitely lots of frameworks out there and tactical sort of techniques and mechanisms to help you work your way through all the things that people get concerned about when it comes to trusting these technologies. And those are just a few ways.
Yep. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, I think part of the narrative around trust in AI has been shaped by we're not really exposed to a lot of the social impact and community development use cases that have been promised with AI. You mentioned one, associated with your PhD research. Can you sort of discuss maybe one or two more where you've seen AI, used in social impact or community development contexts?
Yes, there's one that I really like to lean on, and this is to solve food insecurity issues. And so we were working with a client that um, they had money earmarked to help patients or families and kids apply for SNAP benefits to address their food insecurity issues. And the application was about 30 pages. It's a very complex application. And there's lots of things that are not reasonably understood with this application. And so you might need to depend on a social worker to kind of help you work through getting that application complete such that you can apply and hopefully get the resources needed to start to address your food insecurity issue. The challenge that this particular organization was having was while they had the money earmarked to be able to give food, to be able to give resources to families that needed to have their food insecurity issues addressed, that money was not being tapped into. And it was mostly because the application was a barrier given how complex it was. And then as social workers were also spending a lot of time with families, but also trying to help people work through the application. So what we decided to do was go in and think about what was the right AI enablement to kind of help folks understand that the money is there. We want you to lean into it. We know you got to work through the application to get it. So how can we be helpful? And so we built an avatar. And as we built the avatar, we worked with the social workers to make sure we understood how they show up every day, from look, feel, tone of voice, et cetera, to make sure that people felt comfortable engaging with the avatar. We didn't know whether they would or not. We tried it. It actually worked for a number of reasons. One, we found that the avatar could help them get through the application and also learn about the different types of things that were being asked and what they meant, but also work through the application quickly to get what was needed so that they could actually hopefully be eligible for the benefits and they could actually get those resources. So we did see sort of an increased use of those funds. But the one thing that I thought was interesting that we found, and I don't know if we thought about this going into the project, when we built the avatar, as I mentioned, we built it with the social workers to make sure we understood what's a good way for an avatar to show up and engage with citizens. The feedback that we got from the citizens that engaged with the avatar was that they felt more comfortable engaging with the avatar because the avatar wouldn't judge it, wouldn't judge the fact that they were in this food insecurity space from the beginning. And so they felt comfortable talking to the avatar about those things where they wouldn't feel judged or, sort of labeled in a certain way. And that was one of the things that made the applications go up. And we were able to get more resources of those folks that were experiencing food insecurity. I just think it's such a fascinating business case. And it does go back to the survey that I pointed to earlier, where I said some folks actually feel more comfortable engaging with AI, especially when they don't get judged. And I joke with my husband a lot because he will be on the phone fussing with an AI solution because he's trying to get to a representative. He can't get there. And so he ends up sort of changing his tone as if the AI is going to do something different. Saying speak to a representative, repeating it over and over again, and he can't get there. So he's been in some arguments with AI. But it's interesting because AI won't judge him, right? He can literally call back up again, and AI will be like, okay, how can I help you? And so I do think there's something about not being judged when you're engaging with AI. And I just think that food insecurity issue is like one of our most fascinating examples of it. So.
Great. Thank you. And so thinking about engaging different communities of users, given that children are increasingly being exposed to AI at a young age, you've written a wonderful series of children's books on AI. So can you talk a little bit about that series and how it might help children and parents think about AI and trusting AI?
Yes, so there's a character that I created called Sky. In fact, I have a book right here on my desk because people are always asking me about it. So there's a lot of books like this, but there's 5 books where here's the point, Tom. There is, I believe, an access issue to understanding these technologies because every school doesn't have the resources, every community doesn't have the resources to talk about AI in the classrooms, et cetera. And so we do need to make sure that we can figure out how to push literacy as far as we can. And I thought the books could be one way to do that. Two, as you can see from the book I held up, it's very colorful, it's very engaging. We do have to be thoughtful about creative ways to help people engage with AI because it already sounds complicated. And so how do we do it in a way that hopefully will get people to engage? And Sky is this very stylish and engaging character. And her job is to go around and she explores and she discovers AI initially, and then she goes around and she teaches everyone else about all the things they should learn about AI. And she teaches it in the most responsible way, right? So along the way, she's giving responsible tips, many of which we talked about here, but obviously expressed in kids' terms. And then the other reason why I thought it was important to create the book series, and it's still growing, but I do think a barrier is the way we explain AI. And so the point of the books was to make sure that we could explain AI in the most engaging and very simple way so that we don't create that barrier. And here's what I found. I know we talked about the book being for kids, and it is, but the parents have gotten involved. And there are times where I'll have more parents ask for the book and ask for me to specifically, sign the book to the parent themselves as opposed to the kid, because the parents are trying to learn as well. And so there is something to be said around AI literacy and family learning. And, I'm glad that the books are resonating with a number of communities. We've done a lot pushing the books out across the US. And so, yes, that's something that I love to do outside of my day job. But it is really refreshing to sit back and see how engaged the kids and families are, especially in communities where it's not by default a topic that comes up.
Thanks. And so thinking about AI deployment in our teams and our workforce, Nicole online is asking, are you able to share some of the simulations that you mentioned before of sort of gaming out AI use with your teams? But you're developing an Cornell certificate on AI. You teach a very well-regarded course on leadership in the algorithmic age in the Brooks School's Executive Master of Public Administration program. How are some of the concerns and some of the frameworks and tools that you mentioned in our discussion today? How are those integrated into your teaching?
Yeah, so all of that's going to come up. By the way, I'm looking forward to my class tonight because, as we know, class starts today. And so I can't wait to engage with my class this evening. But we talk about everything from emerging trends in AI to all of the governance and trustworthy principles that we touched on today. We spend a lot of time really thinking through scenarios as the question was asked. We do simulations. By the way, this shows up in the AI certification that I'm working with Cornell on developing, as well as the way it comes up in class. We go through lots of different governance scenarios where there'll be trade-offs and the students have to think about, well, what would I do? What I will tell you always, everybody doesn't always have the same perspective, which makes for a nice, healthy debate on why we would and wouldn't do certain things. And so that is always a fun part of the class. A lot of the governance questions that I talked about early on in the discussion come up in the class as well. And yes, the simulations do come up as well. And I made a note earlier when you just asked a question to maybe share some of those simulations on LinkedIn as well, because there's all different kinds of examples. But all those things come up. We talk about leadership in AI as a discipline, because I do think it's a leadership trait. We talk about things like storytelling. I think storytelling, not just with the books that we just talked about, but telling a story, just like the food insecurity issue that I talked about. That's a great way to start to get people to think about, oh, you know what, it could be used in that way. And maybe there's some other social impact ways that it can be used, but it is a very creative way to get people to really lean into AI when you talk about it. So we talk about the power of storytelling, and we do spend some time talking about, even though it's scary, autonomous futures. And so we spend a lot of time going through the course over a number of weeks and making sure that the students are really leaned in. It's always a really fun course. And I'm taking a lot of those principles and embedding them into the work that I'm doing with Cornell, with the AI certification, with a lot more. And we do talk about some of the other things that I mentioned earlier about data and what that means and how to be a good data steward. My PhD research comes up in the certification when you talk about using AI as a sort of an amplifier, a bias in humans and so forth. And so there's lots that come up. And so you got to sign up if you're interested. And I do share some things on LinkedIn, but yes, we will go deep into these discussions in class tonight, as well as by way of the certification. So I'm excited about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's about all the time that we have left today. So Dr. Austin-Williams, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. Always fantastic connecting with you. Those of you in our audience who joined us online, thank you for your great questions, for joining us as well. Until next time, this is Keynotes.
Thank you so much for having me.